Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It's a Tuesday at about 10:34 on a balmy Christmas wintry day. It's super warm out. It's crazy. Typically in the mornings, what I do is I usually get up in the morning and have some coffee for a little bit, and then I usually do these videos. I used to do them back when I was doing Facebook. About 3 years ago, I was working nights. I had this stupid job in Rockland, and it was cool for a while. But then it got really stupid. But I was working nights, and I would typically come home. I'd get home from work about 10 o'clock or so at night, and usually after work, I would hop in the shower, make some dinner, and do a video. I used to do the Facebook Live video segments on Film Fanatic, and that was what got me started doing it. But I got in the habit of always doing them at night, and then I also was doing videos on like Saturdays or Sundays, like during the day. I would get up in the morning, and there was a time too for a while where like Saturdays or like Sunday mornings or afternoons were days that I would do videos Facebook Live, and that was like how I would usually set up and do the shows. But now I do them in the morning after I've had some coffee. But typically, what I'll do in the morning is I'll get up in the morning, and if I have shows or events I need to promote, I usually do work around that, and then I'll have some coffee, and I'll usually do one of these videos. But usually in between or during it, I'll go to my. I have a little separate music space on my property that I have my crap in, all my music stuff, and I usually get up in the mornings, especially during the winter or cold months, and I'll turn the heat on. I have a little heater in there. I'll turn the heat on and let it warm up for a while. But I went out to do the same thing this morning, and I was like, holy mackerel, it's like t-shirt weather. It's weird. So I didn't even have to turn the heat on. I brought a couple things in there. So today was the first day in a while, the first morning that I haven't had to turn the heat on in there. It's kind of crazy. Usually wintertime, it takes about, you know, 35, 40 minutes at least. On really cold days, it takes almost an hour to be in there. Last night I had to practice, and I had the heat going for about an hour or so before we started practice or jamming. So, but I was like, wow, crazy. So I went to Goodwill on this past Sunday. This past Sunday, and it's now Tuesday, and I got some new Blu-rays. I had not been there for a while. It's my cutoff point because I have not yet bought any Christmas presents, which is kind of awful. So it's my cutoff point. I'm not going to spend any more money now. I'm just got to focus on getting some Christmas presents. Luckily, it's not too much stuff, but so it's my last kind of haul for a while of buying any kind of movies. But anyway, so I went to Goodwill and I got some movies that I like and that I've seen, and I have either I've had on DVD or whatnot. So I got an upgrade. I'm a firm believer when you buy movies, if you like the movies, and obviously if it's a movie that is has a visual thing about it, it's usually the thing to do is to upgrade it on Blu-ray, which I try to do. Like I have the downside of that is when you start making upgrades, and then now there's 4K versions of these films. The one downside of that is if you do that, which again as a fan, as a film fanatic, you get to see the best quality possible of that film that you love or that you like. But that means it's more stuff. It's more stuff, and I'm a physical media whore. I'm always about anything physical media, but obviously it does take up space, and I have run out of shelf space tenfold at this point. So I need to figure that out. But because of the upgrades, that means that I end up having multiple copies of a certain movie. And I could, like, for instance, the movie I probably have the most copies of is the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I have like 5 copies of that movie. It's kind of ridiculous. I have 3 or 4 different DVD copies of it. I have like a special edition and then a collector's edition, and I think I even have it on VHS. And I have 2 versions of it on Blu-ray. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I have like 5 copies of one movie, 5 different versions, and there are 2 other versions that recently just came out, which I'm probably not going to get because I'm pretty happy with what I have. But obviously, that's just one movie, so that is going to take up obviously lots of room. But it's worth it, and I'll figure it out. But always, that's one thing I do is that's one thing I see a lot online are people who are collectors like myself and love movies. They're always looking for that upgrade. They get something on DVD or VHS or something they've had for years on VHS and DVD, and then they want to get that upgrade. And it's always that thing of like, wow, this looks insane and amazing and wonderful. So it's always the way to go. So I got some movies at Goodwill, and typically when I go to Goodwill, I get more quote unquote Hollywood, bigger budget films that I love. And so I got this movie it's the Tupac Shakur story, All Eyes on Me. I bought this the other day on Sunday, and it was $10. I think a little bit too much. I paid a little too much for it. This came out in 2017. It's basically a biopic. I'm not a big fan of biopics, but because it's very tricky. But I got it. This movie came out in 2017, and I remember really liking it. It was kind of around the time when there was an NWA biopic, which is not very good. There's a Biggie Smalls biopic that came out, which is not very good. And I remember when this movie came out, I did not see it in the theater. I rented it on DVD. And I didn't realize it was 2017 already. Time does fly by. I was like, yeah, I liked it. I thought it was really good. And I only seen it one time. It was on DVD. And I really liked it. I remember even talking to people about, those movies that had come out around that time. Movies about hip hop stars, rap artists that were pretty iconic figures in pop culture. And there was a series of these movies, and they're not very good. So, but I remember seeing it, All Eyes on Me, which was the title track for Tupac's debut double album when he signed to Def Jam Records. That's the name of this film. And I remember during the time recommending this movie to people, saying, oh, it's actually a really good movie. It's actually really interesting because it does dive into kind of the inner workings of Def Jam. Def Jam, of course, being Suge Knight, who was the kind of the CEO. He, helped create all of the careers of Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Eminem. I mean, just an endless list of 90s hip hop stars. People that I grew up listening to. I was a huge fan of Snoop Dogg. His first couple albums are classic albums. Dr. Dre as well. Warren G, I actually really love a lot. There were some great Def Jam recording artists at the time. And I watched this movie last night, and I'm like, I don't know, it kind of put me in a bad mood, actually, to be honest. I didn't really enjoy it as much. There were some really weird problems with the movie I found from a technical standpoint. I don't know, because I bought this disc used, it was sealed, which they do anyway at Goodwill, like whether something is brand new or whether something has been used for a while. They always tape and seal the DVDs or CDs if you buy them there. And this definitely was used, but I don't know if it was if it if it's because the DVD was or this Blu-ray is kind of scratched, or I don't know if it is. It's hard to tell, but there's certain things about this DVD Blu-ray that are just not really good. Like um, the editing in this movie is really bad. It's terrible, and I don't know if it's at one point the DVD paused, the Blu-ray paused, like stopped, and I'm like, oh shit, it's scratched because it's used, and but then it kept playing, and then I started to realize, oh wait, it's playing, it's okay, it's not scratched, and then, but I noticed throughout the movie there's all these like really awkward edits that make it feel like, if you see a theatrical film, a good theatrical film, usually the editing is like, well, editing is really key. I mean, that's really what is going to, at the end of the day, kind of make a movie. And that, of course, is a science, and that's a painstaking process to edit a 2 hour, take, say 100 hours and to compress it and make it into a 2 hour feature is insane. So it's a science. It's a real science, and that can really make or break a movie, even if you have great acting or a great story, all of those things. But the editing is, and the editing for this film, I think, is really off-putting and kind of terrible. And it's weird. That kind of thing has not stood out to me in a really, really long time. If you watch a TV movie, and there's a certain way the editing for, say, a TV film and a theatrical film is very different. Usually with, I think, well, like if you see a TV film, more, not so much now, more, I think nowadays, TV shows that are on, all of these streaming platforms are very much modeled off of, or they definitely aesthetically use a lot of the techniques and technical, or a lot of the technique that is used in theatrical films, like where the editing or the budget or the aesthetic, it's got more of a theatrical thing to it, and so it doesn't have that TV vibe to it. Because typically, back in the day when TV movies were a regular thing, like say ABC or USA, the USA Up, network, or movie of the week, or even the old school, like CBS movie of the week. The editing process was always kind of weird because there would be, when they would cut from one scene to the next, it would always be like, what's the way to, how I can describe it? It would be just a kind of a clear segue, or the scene would go black, and then you would just go into the next scene. Whereas like theatrical movies, they usually bleed into the next movie. They fade into the next movie. There's usually a lot more of a gradual shift or change into the next scene. It really blends. Usually, those in a theatrical setting, for a theatrical film, there's more of a blending of those two things together. Whereas TV, the old school method, there's like, it's more of just a cut and into the next scene. Now, like I said, with TV shows on streaming, they've adapted more of the theatrical film technique for television. So now everything quality wise is definitely stronger. But this movie has that TV quality. The editing is so weird. I don't know how else to describe it. The editing is really weird, and it's really kind of jarring, and it took me out of, if I was into a scene, it took me out of this, it took me out of, it kind of disoriented. I felt a little bit disoriented because it felt like that old school way of scene end, scene starts. Like it felt like it was very jumpy. It was very weird. And it has a real cheap, and not in a good way, because I love trash movies to death. But this has like a trashy way that the editing is done in a very bad TV way, back, the old school way, like how I was describing the difference. At least how I feel or look at those two things as being separate. Just abrupt. It's not really cohesive. It's kind of off putting, takes you out of the scene. Really weird. Um, and that was, I mean, and these are more like technical things about the film. The other thing that was absolutely terrible about this movie, obviously, this movie is a biopic about Tupac's life. So there is a ton of music. There's tons of like video or tons of performances and concerts and things like that. And anytime, anytime there are music scenes where there are rappers performing or Tupac is performing, it's so fucking loud. Like all of a sudden, like I literally have, I keep when I watch a movie, I usually keep it at a medium. For bigger budget action films, I'll crank them up a little bit. But usually I keep them at the levels or volume at a medium range because your ears do adjust. And and I usually keep it at that. But for this film, whenever it got to these musical segments, it would be blasting, blasting, and I'm like, what the fuck? So every time that a musical segment would come on, I would have to turn, I'd have to hold my remote, my little remote that I have, and turn the volume down, and it was totally fucked up and totally the mastering was so bad and so off. It's really weird. And again, I never saw this movie on Blu-ray before, but the mastering was so off. And then after the musical sequence would end, or during the musical sequence, it would be just blasting. I have to turn it way down, and then it would cut to a dialogue scene, and I have to turn it up again. And I had to do that throughout the entire movie. And I'm like, I don't know what is going on with this Blu-ray. So between that and the editing, it was terrible. Definitely, like from a technical, visually it looks really good, but from the sound design and even the editing, definitely one of the probably the worst Blu-ray I've ever seen. Really weird. I mean, I saw this movie when it came out on DVD, and again, it's been a few years, 2017. I don't remember that being a thing of as far as editing or the sound. It was really weird. And I don't know, like the movie itself, it's okay. It's okay. I think it's still. I've only seen it the one time. I liked it when I saw it, and watching it now, it was okay. I thought it was meh. It's still, I think, better than some of those other hip hop biopics that came out around this time. They all kind of came out around the same time in like 2016 through 2018. This still, I think, is probably the best one out of them. But they're just kind of like big, bloated, dumb Hollywood movies that are just filled with cliches. And this movie, I think, is better, but still suffers from that ultimately, where it's just like, okay, they do portray Tupac as a person or a figure in pop culture who was a victim of circumstances who was probably wrongfully accused of certain things, but then also did a lot of questionable things and probably some terrible things, but then ultimately was kind of this very antagonistic figure in the world of hip hop, and was kind of he was ultimately a very divisive person. He really wanted to amp up the whole East Coast West Coast thing when that was, kind of a kind of a gangster mentality back then, especially. And, causing this rift, a war, basically, to where violence could or did break out. And he was, at the later part of his career, he really was vehemently, pretty militant about that. And, caused a lot of, anger. The portrayal of Snoop Dogg in this is the actor who plays Snoop Dogg is definitely my favorite part of this movie. He's incredible. It's uncanny how incredible his performances. The rest of the performances are pretty good, pretty solid. But I don't know, like I kind of felt at the end of this movie, I kind of felt depressed. It is a depressing movie in some ways, especially how it ends. But I just felt depressed from not just that and the kind of him, the tragedy of him dying, but I just felt overall just kind of depressed in general about this film. Mainly because I just felt like I felt exhausted, I felt tired, and I just felt like, wow, okay, this is just another big, bloated, fat, fucking Hollywood movie. And it's like, there's too many cliches. There's too many of these things that we've seen before. It just felt really exhausting. And I'm like, there's nothing new. There's nothing. Yeah, they do, and again, I think some of the stuff is true. Probably some of the stuff isn't true. They definitely show Tupac as being someone who was a very intelligent person, brilliant in some ways, as far as his knowledge of, you know, grasping a deeper understanding of of life and his outlook on life and that he was a very well read person. Typically, in the media and everything, he was portrayed as this gangster, and he was blamed for violence at the time. But as a fan of hip hop, and I'm a huge fan of hip hop and rap music, I grew up listening to so much of this music. I still continue to be a huge fan of the genre. I don't know, like Tupac, I feel like I'm not really in all honesty, I'm not a really big fan of some of his music. I think he had a handful of really great tracks. But in comparison to, say, you know, there's one segment in this movie where he's like shitting on, because it's East Coast, West Coast thing, where he's shitting on Nas. Nas had just put out Illmatic, which I think, for me, is probably my favorite hip hop album of all time. Like, that album is just killer, just badass. The best New York hip hop. And that's my favorite hip hop album, probably of all time. Liquid Swords, Jizza, another one, just amazing. I love old school Public Enemy, old school KRS-One. So much great stuff that came out. Tribe Called Quest. I love Mos Def, Gangstar, or Black Star. So many great, hip hop that came out of New York. And then I love the LA stuff though. I love Dr. Dre. I love the first Snoop album. I mean, that was an album I used to listen to religiously. Dr. Dre. That's music is such a part of my culture, but part of my kind of who I am. I love newer stuff. I actually really love Logic. I'm a huge Run the Jewels fan. But I feel like, I don't know, at the end of the day, Tupac wasn't really, I'm not a huge fan of his stuff. He had a few great tracks, but as far as albums go, and for him to take that stance against Nas's Illmatic was like, oh, I'm just kind of like, fuck this guy. He had a couple of good tracks, and he was a pretty good MC, pretty good rapper. He was pretty creative, but I think his consistency as an artist, and being able to listen to one of his albums. I have a couple of his earlier albums, and they're kind of hard. In all honesty, I think they're kind of hard to get through. Before he signed to Def Jam, he put out a couple of rather records, and those records are kind of not very good. In all honesty, there's a couple of good tracks. There's a couple of good tracks on his Def Jam album, All Eyes on Me, the double album. Another album I think is one of my all-time favorites is the first Biggie Smalls album. Like, that's a masterpiece. I consistently like all the way through, but I just feel like Tupac's not. He's a little bit overrated. He became a big-time pop star. The other thing this movie does get into is that he was born. His mother was a big-time activist in the Black Panther movement, and he kind of had an insight in the political workings of that organization, and then also the pressure that they were under. They do show the racism that he faced all the time. And at first, they kind of portray him as this person that, like, at first he was um, having this sense of like political consciousness in his music and his outlook, and trying to, you know, elevate people in a positive way, like showing them that, you know, he when he first had success, he was donating a lot of his money from record proceeds to different charities. He was kind of involved in activism at that point, and he was relatively outspoken about social causes and racism that was going on in class warfare early on in his career. And he seemed to indicate that he was going to have that as part of his world creatively. You know, when you look at activists like, or not activists, but you look at hip hop artists like Public Enemy and KRS One, where they were very much their 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 political views or their social concerns as issues, and them being obviously African American and suffering horrendous, horrors because of the color of their skin in America, that was reflected in their music. And so they were very much militant about that, but rightfully so. And Tupac kind of started out that way, as kind of delivering or showing his art in that way. But it feels like throughout the later part of his career, he became a huge pop star basically, and it seemed like he, you know, in this film really kind of abandoned all of those things that he kind of was initially all about and to a degree outspoken of. That he seemed to kind of abandon that kind of consciousness around social issues and having it in his life through his music, through his art. He seemed to, like, I don't know, abandon all of those things and became, just um just a full-on typical Hollywood rock star, and it seemed like once he became famous, he was an actor. He was also in lots of films at the time. He was in an interesting place as an artist because he was a regular hip hop megastar, but then he was also an actor, and he made a handful of movies that were very successful, and he had both of these careers going at the same time. But it seemed like the more money he made, the more success, he just kind of abandoned all of those other things and became just it was all about the money and getting laid and that was it. Like, he abandoned all of those things. But then he also became entrenched with Suge Knight, who was the CEO, the founder of Def Jam Records, of course, which was the biggest hip hop label of the time, and I don't think any other hip hop label has ever come close to the success that he had. But they do show the thing I like about this movie, and I think it's pretty true because I've read a lot about um, this time period. Not only was I listening to a lot of these records, but I remember reading a lot about Suge Knight and how Def Jam was kind of working, and how what the success was like and the behind the scenes and all those things. And it seems like it's pretty accurate for the most part. But Suge Knight, the way they show him in this movie, he's kind of like, he's he was a he was a gangster. He was like a mafia, boss. That's really what he was. And you know, if anybody took anything away from him, or he suspected that anyone was taking anything away from him, he would kill them. He had no qualms about it, and he ruled with an iron fist. He's kind of a friggin' bastard, and he was a gangster. And they show him, if he had where there are people that he suspected of doing things to him, that he would get his goons out after them and basically kill them or make them disappear or just beat the shit out of them. There's all these scenes of where you see how violent and how much of a gangster he really was. It's kind of off putting, like, and you can kind of understand because they're a product of, you know they had to protect what they had because of growing up in America, which is a very the most racist place on the face of the earth. But I don't know. It's a tricky thing. They really show that dark side to Def Jam and how Suge Knight was just like totally this gangster guy and just was a ruthless bastard. And it was just about the money. It was just about the money and the status, and he could give a shit about anything else or anyone. And if you crossed him or challenged him, forget about it. They get into the dynamic of when Tupac wanted to. He had signed a 3-record contract or 2-record contract with him. First album being All Eyes on Me, and that was a double album. And then there was a second album that he also put out, and and this was all through Death Row Records. And at that point, Tupac was a mega superstar, and he wanted to kind of break away and do his own thing. And Suge Knight would not let him. He basically said he wouldn't, and because he used his basically his threat of violence and his threat as a figure of like being a mafia boss, that he wouldn't let him leave. He could have, but he didn't. And so they get into that dynamic, and which was really messed up and fucked up and horrible. And then they also get into the whole thing of like the whole East Coast West Coast thing of where he eventually just Tupac swore loyalty to Suge Knight and Death Row Records, and became this figurehead before he wanted to kind of create this war between East Coast and West Coast. And then he gets shot and killed. It's interesting too because one of the rappers that was trying to quell any kind of beefs or violence that was possibly going on or that had occurred was Snoop Dogg. He was the one who's saying, "No, I grew up listening to New York and New York rappers, and I grew up listening to LA rappers, and I loved it all. We're all in this together. We're all trying to be creative." He was very outspoken with saying he doesn't have a beef with that. He doesn't. He wanted there to be. He didn't want there to be any divisiveness or violence. He wanted there to be unification and solidarity. But Tupac was no. He was like, no, I want to rule with iron fist, and like fuck the fuck the New York rappers. So it's like, ugh. That's just kind of how I feel about it. And so he was a very complex person, but I don't know. There were a lot of things where I felt like he set himself up for what happened, unfortunately. So, but I think as a movie, it's okay. It's all right. It just kind of put me in a bad mood. It just felt like a big, fat, bloated Hollywood movie. Although it is better than those other films, those other biopics that came out. But I don't know. It's all right. It's okay. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.